This is Ray, with a quick word before we begin. At the Dark Money Files, we're committed to bringing you free-to-access news and information on all aspects of financial crime, and that will always be the deal. This is a free community resource. But if you want to contribute to our costs and support the podcast, you can now become a patron. Search for Patreon TDMF, that's Patreon space TDMF, and you'll find options at the site that will let you choose your level of commitment. As a reward, we'll give you access to our premium additional content every month. You'll also get access to past extra content too, and every Patreon member gets the main podcast, with special introductory and closing commentary from us, 48 hours before the public feed. If it's within your means to support our mission, we'd love to have you as a patron. Now, on with the podcast. Hello, and welcome to the 5th episode of Season 7 of the Dark Money Files, in which we shine a light into a murky world. I am Ray Blake, and with me is my co-host, friend and business partner, Graham Barrow. Hello, Graham.
Hello, Ray.
And we interrupt our normal schedule to bring you breaking news.
Oh, not again, Ray.
Well, it's never... it's never dull, is it, Graham?
No, and I suspect I know where you're going with this, Ray, but why don't you enlighten me?
There's been a new addition to the European Super League, Graham.
Ray, I know you love your football, but this is the Dark Money Files podcast, not one of our After Dark specials.
Well, I'm not talking about the Football Super League, though. I'm talking about the Special League of Banks who've been fined and threatened with prosecution over their anti-money laundering controls.
So this is the ABN AMRO story after all.
Well, we could hardly ignore it, could we?
Not really. Whilst fines have become somewhat commonplace, the facts surrounding this story are rather startling.
And we know this because the Netherlands of today published a detailed report on the criminal investigation they initiated back in 2019, after, it has to be said, several years of repeatedly voicing concerns.
Yes, and also on the same day, I see that Chris Vogelzang resigned as in his role as the CEO of Danske as a consequence of that. Doubtless we'll talk about that too. But as it is today that this has all happened and we're recording straight away, we're just going to work through the report as it's published because we don't have the time to organise our responses into a rather more thematic approach.
And the report starts by reviewing the recent history of the company, which of course was partly bought by a consortium led by RBS, which contributed somewhat to their own troubles, and also included Fortis, which was nationalised as a result of the financial crisis, and which ultimately led to the new ABN AMRO, still partly owned by the Dutch government, but for which the remaining shares were listed on the Amsterdam Exchange back in 2015.
Echoes of some of the banks here in the UK there, Ray.
Yes, and in other respects there are traces of Danske Bank, because the report makes clear that long after the merger, just like Danske Bank was at the same time, ABN AMRO was still using fragmented systems and on a decentralised basis. They hadn't committed the necessary investment to implement centralised IT systems across the group.
And I see it also says right at the outset that the investigation was prompted by repeated internal and external reports of serious failings in the bank's AML systems and controls, along, it says, with several criminal investigations by the police and the FIOD, which is the Dutch government's Fiscal Information and Investigation Service.
Yeah, now, one might wonder what prompted those criminal investigations, but given it covers much the same time as reporting on various laundromats was hitting the news media, it's likely, I would think, that some of it was prompted by those laundromats and the companies that enabled them.
That's not an unreasonable suggestion, Ray, although, as we will find out later in the report, there was plenty of homegrown criminality to worry about as well.
Indeed. The report then provides the legal and regulatory background, which I don't think we need to go into in this episode because it covers the anti-money laundering requirements we've talked about regularly over the past 2 years.
I completely agree, Ray, and we probably need the time anyway to talk about the details.
Well, those are certainly more likely to be of interest to our listeners, I think.
So, we get to the part of the report headed Investigative Findings.
That's the bit where we sit up and start paying attention, I think.
Yes. The first thing it says is that both compliance and audit conducted reviews which reported several shortcomings to the senior management.
And one of the first questions we ask when doing a review is about how well listened to is your risk function. So the FCA's Financial Crime Guide explicitly states that financial crime risk must be taken as seriously as other risks, and senior management should be actively engaged in the firm's approach to addressing them. And the EBA's guidelines on internal governance has a similar message for firms in the EU.
But it would appear it wasn't the case with ABN AMRO, at least until quite recently.
Yeah, and then there's a list of the identified shortcomings, which, if I'm being honest, covers just about every aspect of the control environment.
Yes, so for a start, there are incomplete client files, insufficient due diligence, and shortcomings in both risk assessments and classification.
And then there's insufficient consideration of the use of cash, shortcomings in monitoring, both in relation to client reviews and transactional activity.
And finally, there were no or not timely reporting of unusual transactions, and the same issue when terminating client relationships.
And as I said, Graham, just about every control wasn't working properly.
And this was across all 4 business lines, so it wasn't an isolated incident.
No, absolutely. The report then dives into some of the detail which we don't have time to cover here, but it's worth drawing out a few highlights.
Highlights?
Well, you know what I mean. The first thing that caught my eye was the rather astonishing assertion that after having conducted a review in 2018, the bank didn't know the first names of 1,000 private banking clients or of 7,000 retail banking clients.
Right, how on earth do you perform proper identification and verification without knowing the client's first name?
Well, I mean, it's a good question, Graham, and one that the report doesn't answer, unfortunately.
Oh, and this was after an investigation in the private bank in 2014, which uncovered a tranche of issues.
Including ID&V that wasn't in order, incomplete or unclear information in respect to the purpose and nature of the relationship, incomplete or unclear information in respect to the origin of funds, and issues as to whether the client or the underlying beneficial owner was a PEP.
You know, anyone who's read the Deutsche Bank final notice from back in the day, which of course we both have, will recognise some extraordinary similarities to what you've just said.
I was thinking much the same thing. This was followed by an order from the DNB, the Dutch central bank, to remediate all private banking files.
In 2015?
Yes.
3 years before discovering they didn't know the first names of 1,000 of their clients?
Yeah.
You'd have to question the effectiveness of that remediation then, wouldn't you?
Well, I mean, I would, yeah. I mean, the possibility exists, I suppose, although the thought terrifies me that these could be on boards subsequent to that remediation, which doesn't bear thinking about, does it?
No.
They also found issues with their correspondent banking files in a review that took place in 2016 and 17, where the due diligence was often incomplete and enhanced due diligence hadn't been carried out at all.
Oops.
Yeah, and then in 2019, both compliance and audit reported that due diligence still wasn't being carried out sufficiently across the entire client base.
Okay, so I think we can understand why the report talks about repeated and ongoing issues in respect of their compliance with the regulations.
Yes, and then we come on to risk classifications. Apparently, the lowest level of risk was given the grade of, and I'm quoting here, 00 neutral, which I always want to call 00 neutral.
Yeah, it's like an ineffective secret agent, isn't it?
It absolutely is.
Okay, so these customers were then not subjected to any form of periodic review, as I read.
Which might be okay if you had high quality information at the start of the relationship and systems that would detect automatically any changes to the customer's profile that would affect the risk rating.
I'm going to guess that wasn't the case here, though.
Well, no. And because the transaction monitoring system was different for different business lines and client groups, clients in the lowest risk category could avoid having transactions flagged because the system wasn't well set up to respond to them.
And we also find out that the classification into the lowest risk group was done on the basis of an automated analysis of client data without any sort of risk analysis taking place. What's more, if you were classified into that lowest risk group, the report says that the bank didn't ask why you were opening the account or what the source of your funds was.
So if a customer was onboarded with insufficient details, classified as low risk, not subject to periodic reviews, and the transaction monitoring wasn't working effectively, you could stay there forever as a 00, putting highly suspicious payments through your account, and no one would be any the wiser.
I think that was the problem. Yeah. And what's more, DNB's file research discovered that several retail customers were using their retail accounts for business purposes, ranging from real estate trading to dealing in crypto, art, jewellery and shipbuilding.
Shipbuilding?
Apparently.
Okay, right. And I suppose the issue here is not that they were using the account for the wrong purposes, because, that's a commercial terms issue, but that the transaction monitoring would have been inappropriate to catch suspicious activity, which is definitely a financial crime issue.
Exactly. It would be looking for the wrong things, potentially ignoring serious signs of money laundering or terrorism financing. The report goes on to state that in 2014, 96% of the private bank's clients were classified as neutral risk, which seems, quite a high proportion to me.
And me. That's a lot of 00s.
It surely is. And in 2017, 1/3 of the bank's commercial real estate clients were also classified as 00 neutral risk, which meant they were not subject to any sort of risk analysis before the commencement of the relationship.
Now, bear in mind that this is a sector that FATF and pretty much every national risk assessment calls out as a high-risk sector.
Exactly, Ray. And although that's only one factor in the client risk assessment, these numbers make it look as if it wasn't properly weighted in the risk model.
Okay, let's move on to the part of the report that discusses the risks surrounding the use of cash. And we find that the bank did not sufficiently assess the purpose and nature of accounts, in particular the role that cash might play in the transactional activity.
Yeah, there's an interesting comment in the report here where they say, quotes, "The threshold for the cash scenarios implemented in the transaction monitoring system were too high in a number of situations, so that alerts on, for instance, some large cash withdrawals were not generated."
Now, Graham, if you have legitimate funds in your account, why is it a problem if you withdraw some or all of it as cash? It's your money after all.
Well, I agree, Ray, but that's predicated on as long as you know the funds are legitimate. Of course, if you haven't got a clear idea what the source of funds is, then that can be problematic.
And then large cash withdrawals might be indicative of other criminal activity like terrorism financing, for example.
Yes, but let's move on to what the report calls client filtering, but we would more commonly know it as adverse media screening.
And it relays the somewhat surprising information that until September of 2018, ABN AMRO did not perform automated adverse media screening, but instead had a manual process that was triggered by, among other things, a reassessment, by which I imagine they're referring to what we'd call an event-driven review.
But surely one of the reasons for a reassessment or an EDR would be the discovery of adverse media.
It's known as a circular reference in Excel.
Thank you, Ray.
Well, you're welcome. It happens again when the report looks specifically at event-driven reviews, because 00 neutral clients were only subject to event-driven reviews rather than periodic reviews, and the system that was supposed to generate the information to trigger the review wasn't adequate because the risk classification wasn't set high enough to generate the signals. And all of that means that it couldn't ever really work as expected.
Oh boy.
Yeah, so let's move on. The report continues with what I can only call some of the usual suspects in an investigation such as this.
Yeah, like backlogs of transaction monitoring alerts causing significant delays to suspicious activity reporting.
Or not reporting at all.
Yes, alongside an ineffective client termination process, which meant that some clients were exited, some were only partially exited, and there was no process in place to stop some of them from being onboarded again at some point in the future.
And how many times have we seen that?
A lot.
And that's followed by some specific examples, some of which are quite hair-raising, but frankly there are too many for us to look at them all in this podcast episode. And focusing on the examples is less useful, perhaps, than analysing the bigger picture and looking at the failings that produced those examples.
I completely agree, Ray, but that really shouldn't stop our readers from going to the Netherlands regulator's website, downloading the report and reading them for themselves.
Well, definitely not. We've said repeatedly that one of the best ways for firms to test their own internal systems is to measure them against a report such as this, with as neutral an approach as they can to see how they would perform under the same scrutiny.
Yes, or if they want to guarantee the neutrality of the report, they could ask us to do it for them.
A Dark Money Files report assessing your firm's exposure to this and potentially other public findings could be a very useful governance tool, and we guarantee complete confidentiality.
We do, for reasons, of course, that we can never talk about. For that confidentiality to happen, we've become exceptionally good at it across a huge variety of scenarios.
We should say, in the interest of balance, Graham, that other consultancy firms are available.
Yeah, but some very good ones, but this is our podcast, Ray.
Well, good point, Graham. And to finish off this quick review, we should mention at the very end of the report the comment that ABN AMRO have engaged openly and completely with the requirements of the investigators and have taken strong active steps already to remedy and improve their systems and controls.
And well done them, but I think otherwise the fine would have been rather higher, I guess.
Well, yeah, although I do have one thought about the fine.
Which is?
Well, it's composed of two elements. €300 million is a punitive fine and 180 million is disgorgement of the savings calculated to have been made by ABN AMRO in not properly investing in the resources to adequately perform their anti-money laundering requirements.
Which seems fair enough.
Well, yeah, but what it doesn't cover is the profit ABN AMRO almost certainly made by conducting what's now seen as likely being significant amounts of business processing criminal funds.
Which I guess might just possibly have been more than the total amount they've now been required to pay.
It might have been, although we can never know for sure.
It's a sobering thought, though, isn't it?
It is, and you can't help but wonder whether the continuing investigation into the possible criminal culpability of 3 ABN AMRO executives will address this issue.
One of which, of course, is Chris Vogelsang, who we mentioned at the start of this podcast.
The aforementioned, yes.
Subsequently employed by Danske Bank as their CEO. And I guess there's a story there about the due diligence of Mr. Vogelzang's employment.
It is, but I think that's where we're going to leave for now, this brief review of the breaking story at ABN AMRO. What's next?
Ray, we've been promising for a while to do an episode on critical thinking, which keeps getting hijacked. It's actually all ready to be recorded, so I think we should do that next.
I really am looking forward to it.